Perfect. All right. Wonderful. So good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. So I just also enabled summary so that we can have a good AI generated summary of this presentation. So as I said, today we're going to deep dive a little bit more about this PRIB capstone experience, the Policy Hackathon. So I assume you're here because you're either interested in knowing what is PRIB, what does that stand for, what this program is about, or you're really intrigued about this Policy Hackathon experience. And we're going to tell you and share with you both of these two key questions. So before we dive into the real content, I just want to share a little bit about myself, and then I'll pass the mic to Alex. So my name is Shilin Liu. I'm part of the admissions team at UChicago Harris. Essentially, I manage all of our non-degree credential programs at UChicago Harris. I myself am an alum. I graduated from Harris back in 2017 with an MPP degree, and since then I've been starting working at Harris. So very, very happy with where I was, where I am, and particularly exciting to launch about this Policy Research Innovation Bootcamp this year for the first time. This is our first in-person Chicago summer program since the pandemic. So we're particularly exciting to welcome all of you to come to Chicago during the best summer season. And my background is pretty diverse. I worked in different industry sectors, different roles. So I bring a little bit more of essentially kind of leadership skills in the sense of trying to find your authentic voice. And today I'm not going to be the main speaker. We'll probably have another session with me talking about more on the leadership and coaching side, leveraging my personal experience and my personal growth. But today, the real speaker is my colleague, Alex Sobczynski. So Alex, I'm going to pass the mic to you, and you can share a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so my name's Alex. I am a graduate of Harris. I have my master's with a certificate in research methods here. And these are some of the places that I have, worked at or contributed to via my research. So I'm kind of happy to share with you what the Policy Hackathon is going to look like, and how we plan to sort of integrate, learning about the research experience and opportunities at UChicago with sort of like a really hands-on experience developing those skills through policy.
Great. So Alex and myself, we are the two people among a larger group. If you join us as part of this PRIB experience, that you will see us on a daily basis. So Alex, particular, is one of the graduate instructors at UChicago Harris, as she just mentioned. She's also going to be the head TA, the teaching assistant, and also one of the graduate instructor for this particular program. So during those 2 to 3 weeks of PRIB experience, depending on whether you're going to join us for that optional Jumpstart week. You will spend a lot of time with both Alex and myself, but as well as other TAs, and also, of course, our faculty lead, Austin Wright, who is not with us today, but we're happy to share with you. I believe he actually had a recording of his previous mini class. Maybe Lingyang, you can find it in the Zoom chat and share with our participants. So, as you probably heard from us, or you probably received many of the emails from us about the PRIB program. So this program is a very holistic experience. Yes, it's very, based on academic research and rigorous, research methodology training. But at the same time, it gives you a lot more than just lectures, theory, knowledge. That's part of where we want to design this policy hackathon experience that you will learn more from Alex from today's session from. But also, for example, we have some workshops about, identifying your authentic leadership voice. We have a lot of seminars with UChicago research centers, executives, and researchers across the campus, because we know there's just so many great resources on this university, which is a great comprehensive research institute beyond our own Harris Public Policy School, that we want to bring to your plate as part of this PRIB experience. And we'll also organize a one-day career track focusing on social sector and social impact work outside academia. So you will go to organizations in different sectors, in different companies, and learn about once I have those research oriented or data analytics skills, how can I move forward with my professional planning if I'm thinking more than just staying in academia or as a pure academics, right? So I think that being said, there are so many things that we cannot wait to offer you and share more for you as part of this presentation. So feel free to, again, use the chat box if you have any questions, and we're gonna start the Q&A later. So now let's talk about Policy Hackathon. Alex, back to you.
So yeah, as you can see, like there are several modules. So module 1 is kind of focusing on, what research is and how that's built. So not necessarily the technical piece, which will be covered in the optional Jumpstart week before those 2 in-person weeks of the program. But really thinking about what it is to craft impactful research, and how research interact with each other, and how analysis and qualitative research kind of like come together to build good policy and to inform stakeholders. And then we're also going to have some seminars. And the Policy Hackathon is like really your chance to apply those skills that you're learning in modules 1 and 2, and will eventually apply further through the workshops and learn more about in the career track. And the idea is really that we're going to give you a task, and you are going to use data analysis skills and sort of background research skills that we're going to kind of develop throughout that first week to pull together sort of like a mock policy, present it to your classmates, and then sort of develop from there. So we're thinking right now that we're going to pick from potentially 1 of 2 tasks. And one might focus on a data set that was generated through several researchers at Yale and in Ghana, following a set of farmers through several years in a rural area of Ghana. And so if we're thinking about there, how can we build policy or potentially programs by learning about the experiences of farmers in that area over several years. And then also thinking about potentially a focus on climate sensors in Chicago, which measure several indicators of urban, pollution and air quality, and then linking those to census outcomes and welfare. So those are two of the things that we're thinking about. And maybe I can tell you a little bit more about kind of what the guts of this program are going to look like. So really, we're kind of moving through 3 stages. So the first one is developing context. So you might have done this if you've ever sort of written a paper or reviewed some literature, going through reports that have already been written by others or reading news articles. So this is sort of building context around the situation that we're interested in before we develop a new understanding from data that's been gathered. So the tasks are sort of built around a data set, but before you can really dig into that, the goal is sort of to develop context. So this is looking at on-the-ground reporting through news agencies that haven't really dug into the data or done that deep context building. And you're kind of pull from those quick kind of like crisis response reporting, as well as doing an academic literature review of situations inside and outside of the area. So really the idea is to kind of learn where everyone else in the field already is, and from there figure out where you can add on and what sort of policy might be the best. And then the second piece is kind of moving into data analysis. And these are some of the skills that we're hoping to build, firstly through that Jumpstart week, and additionally through some of the some walkthroughs of sort of data analysis that we're going to have in that first week, alongside those lectures that are going to be hosted by Austin, who's our faculty lead, sort of pulling things together. So the goal there is that for some of you that might focus more on R programming and like really deep quantitative research. For others, that'll be sort of like supporting your team members and pulling that together. So this will include generating visuals, as well as in some cases, depending on students' comfort level, doing actual econometric analysis. And sort of like wherever you're starting out with, there's definitely a way to add a data component. And myself and the other TAs for the program are definitely here to help you maybe elevate those skills beyond what we're already comfortable with, and add maybe an econometric technique that you haven't used before. And then from there, we're going to kind of move on to policy recommendations. So once you've developed context and learned what's already being done in the field, and once you've done sort of your own analysis of data that hasn't really been dug into yet, from there is kind of where we're going to generate policy recommendations. So this is sort of linking those two together. And so eventually on this last day of the Policy Hackathon, you'll present this to your classmates and sort of receive feedback from faculty. And that opportunity for feedback should help you sort of link, like, what did I do in the first two pieces and when I was developing context and when I was analyzing data, and how is that actually going to play into a policy that might potentially be implemented, and really kind of like learning from people who have experienced this whole research process through this sort of like mock experience that we're building for you.
Great.
So maybe we can move on.
Yeah, I think, one thing that Alex really laid out very well here is, these are the three very clear steps. At the same time, it's only 3 days. So when first Alex and we were discussing all this, I was like, can our students handle this? That's why it's called a policy hackathon, because you're going to do group work. You're going to probably pour in more than 6 hours during those 3 days on average, to make yourself fully immersed in this, engaging experience. But it is going to be challenging and rewarding. And I think one of the best things that we look forward to any of our in-person programs is we believe there's like an energy, there's like a vibe that just, it can only happen when people are in the same room, when they are smelling the same air, and when you're not going to leave the room without solving the question or the problem. So these are the things that we want to make sure that, one, you feel excited about this intensive group work and peer support experience. Secondly, there's a very clear structure during those entire 3-week experience with PRIB, as well as this 3-day hackathon experience. And the third is you have a strong team, whether it's your academic leadership team or your administrative team like myself. So you have people that you can talk to during the entire program experience. So this is going to be a very similar to, for example, in real life, right? When you jump into a project that your boss asks you to do. So how you can create some meaningful impact or some deliverables in a short term of time. So that's why we want to use this policy hackathon format to replicate that real life experience. And I know that I skipped one slide, which is very important also to give you a overview of essentially how the 2 or 3 weeks look like. The reason why I keep saying 2 or 3 weeks is because, as Alex just mentioned, we have optional Jumpstart Week for those who want to refresh some of the foundational quantitative analysis skills, or we're going to also we're going to give you some programming R teaching. So if you really want to play a heavy data analytics role, we highly recommend you to leverage this optional Jumpstart Week to be with us for 3 weeks rather than 2. So that's why we keep saying this program is either 2 or 3 weeks. But the Jumpstart Weeks in the end optional, because we do know some of you probably have already prior research experience or prior quantitative experience, or your undergrad major is statistics. So we know that you may bring different backgrounds to the program. So the official program start date would be July 29th after the Jumpstart optional week. And then, as Alex just mentioned, we'll spend the full first week to dive into the crafting impactful research and also hanging out with our research center executives and researchers. And then this policy hackathon starts at the beginning of the week 2, and then we'll give you some leadership training workshops, and we'll conclude the program with a social impact career track, and of course our celebration, our big party. So this is a very intense and packed 3-week experience. So you can expect that you will definitely be busy during our PRIB program. All right, Alex, I'm gonna kick it back to you.
Yeah, so I just kind of wanted to jump a little bit more into what that developing context piece looks like. So before we really do analysis, we need to kind of determine what the objectives of a policy are going to be. So even though we might start with just this general idea of, for example, with our 2 tasks, like how can we aid smallholder farmers in Ghana, or how can we support low-income urban families in, urban Chicago? If even though we're starting with those, you kind of need to build into the roots of what that policy looks like. And so in this sort of like context period, you're looking to build a framework for answering some of these questions. So, what kind of people are we wanting to target with an intervention? And also thinking about what diversity looks like within a target group. And part of why I think it's important to kind of come into this when we're talking about a policy hackathon is, I think, especially in this age, we can kind of forget about the qualitative piece of research and what we can't do with data. So a really important piece of developing context is kind of digging into that qualitative piece that you're not really able to really eke out with data. And those two can really work in conjunction, the qualitative research and the thinking about sort of intersectionality in a philosophical way often, and linking that with more like rote quantitative analysis. So we also think about like what is diversity, or to use like a more economics term, like what does that heterogeneity look like within this group, and how are those groups, how are the subsets of that group different across the sample that we're trying to intervene with. So those are some of the things that we're going to think about as well. And in certain situations, there might be key players. So your audience might be, people who are working at a government, or people who are running an NGO. And you might also need to think about how those two groups interact. So doing background research on all of those groups and how they are working together, and how they might be concerned about some outcomes, or how their funding might not be relevant for some problems but would be relevant for others, is another element that we kind of do background research on before we even jump into the data analysis. And kind of fourth point here is thinking about the externalities of a policy on a population. So for example, in some of the work that I do with the World Bank or the UNHCR, you're working with really vulnerable populations. And for example, if you think that providing some amount of money to a group of people is going to help them out, which in many ways it can, you also need to think about what the impacts of that influx of cash or potentially an asset are going to be on the markets in that area, or on some of those other key players, especially in kind of less secure settings where there's less of what we call state capacity. So these are some of the points that we'll kind of dig into more. First, in that first week where Austin is giving lectures, and also throughout the Policy Hackathon, where we're thinking really about the nitty-gritty of the policy that we're going to try to generate. And I also want to kind of put forward. So these are kind of like team activities. So you're gonna split into teams, and then within your team, you're really going to focus on building policy. But I think that the way that the Policy Hackathon is designed also means that you have an opportunity, at least for the developing context stage, to work together and tend to learn from, the thinking patterns of other groups, and kind of like model that diversity within the policy making industry, and across, thought processes, to build the best policies, which is definitely something that we see in the real policymaking world. So yeah. So a little bit more on background research. There are kind of like these two areas that we kind of look at. The first is sort of academia. So these are peer-reviewed journals that focus on sort of like rote implementation. So they might have had the opportunity to look at this policy from the perspective of doing an experiment. So having like a treatment and a control group, very scientific, similar to what you might see in an actual lab in the physical sciences as opposed to the social sciences. So we think about like what kind of technology is available to include in our policy. So this might be, an app that you could provide to users and to the target population. Or if you're doing agricultural technology, this might be something like a well or a water tank. And also thinking about how do communities organize, and how can you use that sort of social infrastructure to build the best possible policy. And then we also think about, historical policies, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and why might that apply to the situation that we're trying to build a policy in, and why might it not, which is something called external validity, and also sort of measuring whether or not those policies worked in the first place, and whether or not they're worth pursuing in the future. Developing context is something that we all tend to do via on-the-ground reporting and what are called white papers and NGO publications. So those are a little bit different from academic publications because they're not peer reviewed, which means that other scientists didn't really get into the weeds and figure out whether or not they were really done in a rigorous way. But that building that context can kind of help build the minutia of what's happening on the ground in the moment, and then help you understand like what are those tweaks that you're going to need to make that might really generate a difference given the very specific context that we're building in. Yeah. So the next piece, as I mentioned, is sort of using data to inform policy. So I know for some people, and when I was sort of starting out, these skills can be kind of scary because you need to not only learn how data works and find the data in the first place, but also potentially learn programs that you're not familiar with. So we're going to focus primarily in R. And as I mentioned, all the TAs are going to sort of be here to help you develop those skills if you haven't been able to develop them already. And part of the reason we're having you break into groups in the first place is so that we can really have sort of like a data point person who might have a little bit more experience in this area. But to get into a little bit more of what we're going to be generating to inform policy, there are sort of like 3 buckets that data analysis goes into. And the first is sort of like descriptive statistics. So understanding just like what does the data look like in a number? So we can think of those on a basic level as like what is the average and the variance within some piece of data. And also thinking about how that varies by demographic. And this is kind of pulling into some of the diversity concepts that I was mentioning before. So that's sort of the first bucket. Secondly, we're going to help you build some maps and visuals, which personally I'm really excited about. I love mapping things and sort of understanding like on a spatial level how things are changing or where there are clusters, and thinking about why that might be the case and how a policy might be able to influence the people in those areas in a positive way. And generating visuals can also kind of like make those descriptive statistics intuitive. So it helps you compare and contrast and really build something that is presentable to a stakeholder, kind of like your elevator pitch in a picture. And then moving on is sort of modeling. So modeling is sort of the more technical causal piece of data analysis. And for some of you that may not make sense for your policy, but for others, it might be something that's really interested, especially if you're wanting to go on to do graduate work. Economic modeling is really sort of like the root of what a lot of us do in graduate school. So this is kind of thinking about how phenomena are correlated and how even if 2 things are correlated, how can we show that one thing is causing the other, which is really quite technical, and also thinking about how shocks might impact communities, which is really relevant to policy, especially in areas that I mentioned might have low state capacity, where a government might make a decision and it kind of throws the economy totally off track. So let's kind of move on from here. So these are just some visuals to kind of pull those together. So as you can see when we describe, and this is kind of an example thinking about gentrification in Chicago. There are lots of ways we might apply this. So describing is kind of just looking at the numbers and kind of digging into the data and seeing where the comparisons and the contrasts are. So this is thinking, how does gentrification differentially impact people by race? We might also want to visualize that by looking at a map and seeing sort of like where are people segregated and where are we seeing clustering and why might we see clustering in the first place. And this is sort of you may not be thinking causally, you might be thinking intuitively and kind of figuring out, okay, if I'm seeing this on a map, maybe I'm going to want to try to generate this model and see if I get any significance there. And that's kind of where we move on to analyzing. And this particular paper where I pulled this graph from, we're kind of looking at in what communities are we expecting people to displace more due to gentrification, and how might that be different by race? And this particular graph is finding that Black people in gentrifying communities are more likely to displace. And I'm kind of thinking, where does that inequity come from, and what might the policies be to sort of like keep that inequity from perpetuating in the future? So from here, we're going to kind of think about designing a policy. So this is sort of like the end of the program, or sorry, the policy hackathon, but we kind of have been building up to this the entire time. So we're kind of asking these questions of like, what are the mechanics of the policy, and what are the actual like things that we're going to do, and what are the almost the administrative pieces of doing that. So what sort of technology might we use? And how can we sort of like address those vulnerable subsets of people? And you can kind of see that these questions are kind of translated over from that first developing context piece that we did, filtered through what we just learned from the analysis. So we can think, how are stakeholders going to be involved, and how might government interests be rectified through the rollout of this policy, and thinking about that on a more practical level. As well as thinking about cost effectiveness and testing a policy, and whether or not we can, at the end of the implementation of our policy, say, did this work or did this not work? And how can this policy help teach future policymakers about, helping people around the world? So yeah, this is the schedule again.
Perfect.
Maybe Shilin can mention.
Great. So I think this is just to recap, what Alex went into, very detailed illustration of these 3-day experience. But again, I think you can imagine this policy hackathon as a culmination of essentially the entire 3 or 2-week experience. And we're going to give you, as Alex mentioned, we're going to give you the task. So you don't need to think about, gosh, which problem or which, policy issue that I want to focus on. We're going to give you that issue. We're going to give you some, Alex, are we giving people like some kind of data sets, right? And some very guided, process during this 2 or 3 days. And as we mentioned many times, this is going to be a exciting group work experience that, again, in the past, we've seen from this kind of policy hackathon type of experience that each group may go to an entirely different direction. And that's actually what we want, because we really want people to think, essentially creatively, and also find, for example, you may find different contexts through that step 1 that Alex mentioned. Your group members may have a very specific interest in this particular topic that brings a different perspective. So there's so many ways for you to explore the same topic, differently and creatively as an individual with your group members. So we really think this is going to be exciting experience for you to learn those theoretical knowledge to put into practice, as well as form some very strong bonding, not only with our teaching team, but as well as with our cohort members together. And again, so we hope that this will replicate the best as a real world experience, whether you want to become a researcher in the academia world or in a research institute, generating those white papers or peer-reviewed journal articles, or you want to use all of what you learned as for example, like a consultant or like a critical thinker, right? So there are different roles for you to play using this skills, and we believe the policy hackathon is the best play for us to put together for you, and then we can have fun together. All right, so thank you so much, Alex, for just demonstrating essentially what are the steps and what are the resources that our participants will get from this entire policy hackathon experience. So before we jump into the Q&A session, just I know, again, some of you are already committed to join this program, so you don't need to pay attention to this part. But if you're still thinking about applying, you still have time to apply, especially if you're an international citizen that you need a visa to come to the US. We definitely encourage you to apply now because it takes time to apply for the visa, etc. So the application itself is very easy, and you can just go to our program website, and then you will see all of the detailed information there as well. So you don't need to take any notes here, but essentially we're going to just ask for your resume, your academic transcripts. Unofficial transcript is fine, motivation statement, and also English language proficiency if you're international applicant. So, and the next deadline for the program is April 23rd. So you still have plenty of time to submit your application for the next round. And we definitely offer a merit-based scholarship. So once you apply for the program, and then you can expect us to get, once we release the admissions decisions, if you do have scholarship that offered by us, you will receive both the admissions decision as well as the scholarship decision from us at the same time. So you don't need to do anything extra or additional to be able to be considered for the merit-based scholarship. And also we provide, a limited amount of on-campus housing. You're going to live in the college dorms on campus. Again, this is also the other reason why you should apply earlier, is because we're going to do this on a rolling basis, that we're going to send surveys out to our admitted students, and then you can indicate whether you need on-campus housing, which is in general cheaper than if you are going to stay in a hotel or an Airbnb, and it's more secured. There are many reasons that why you want to have a truly, I would say, Chicago experience as a student living in the dorms. So we do have the capacity to support you of that. And also, as I mentioned a little bit already, if you are an international student that needs a visa, this program will require a B1 visa to enter the US. And we can also issue you a support letter when you go to the US Embassy in your city or country. Then you can just demonstrate this letter, and hopefully you will get a very smooth visa interview process. All right, so any questions, feel free to raise your hand now. I'm going to stop sharing the screen, but you can also find this email address everywhere on our website. If you have any questions to follow up, you can just send us email, and my team will try to respond it within just a few days. So thank you very much. I think we can stop